Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have you all back for our usual the monthly clinical program on behalf of the College of Specialists for Rheumatology and Rehabilitation Sri Lanka. We were able to have the last two meetings as webinars and hope that you all join in, and its links are still available through our college website as a YouTube presentation. You can watch that if interested. We had few interesting programs last month. So we are back here with rough social distancing and patients. But so we'll be continuing first Friday from here after close of the year. So for the today's program, I have the pleasure of inviting two lecturers. Dr. Gulendrika Kasturasana is the consultant Rheumatology Rehabilitation National of Sri Lanka. She will be doing the good, the bad, and the ugly of inflammation, which will be followed by lupus with the lymph by Dr. Danushka Vittarage, Senior Registrar Rheumatology and Rehabilitation, National Hospital, Sri Lanka. So, to start off the proceedings, I will invite Dr. Gulendrika to carry on with the presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I have selected this good, bad, and ugly of inflammation as a topic because as rheumatologists, we are always fighting against inflammation. Inflammation is a physiological defense mechanism. It is the response by the immune system of the body, insults like infection or tissue breakdown. It could be localized or systemic. An example for a localized inflammation is an acute body joint, where you will see all the cardinal features of inflammation, like redness, warmth, swelling, pain, and loss of function. When it is systemic, the individual will get constitutional symptoms. Mainly, those people will be febrile. Sometimes it is fever of unknown origin. But every time when there is inflammation, evidence of inflammation, excluding infection is given high priority. When this inflammation is like when the intensity of inflammation and the duration becomes inappropriate and destructive, then the inflammatory diseases will result. Autoimmune disease is one of them. There are multifactorial factors initiating this disease process, and then finally there will be activation and proliferation of reactive T cells, resulting in tissue injury and inflammation. Autoimmune disease is likely to be the commonest non-infectious etiology of fever of unknown origin. So, for a healthy lifespan, this inflammation or the immune response has to be in a balance. It is good, because inflammation is useful to clear pathogens, repair damage, and regenerate tissues, and it will maintain the beneficial bacterial flora. The ugly of it is that in chronic inflammatory conditions, a chronic disease, and it's chronic inflammation. And the bad of inflammation is when it is intense or when it is dysregulated. One example is septic shock or the systemic inflammatory response syndrome. And in autoimmune disease also, they can present with intense inflammation. We call it SIRS or systemic inflammatory response syndrome. So rest of the speech will be about bad of inflammation. SIRS or systemic inflammatory response syndrome is an exaggerated defense mechanism. So the noxious stressor will be either infection or any kind of tissue breakdown or tissue injury where there is no infection. And it will involve release of acute phase reactants. There will be widespread autonomic, endocrine, hematological, immunological alteration in the subject. And a dysregulated cytokine storm with potential to cause massive inflammatory cascade, leading to reversible or irreversible endogenous dysfunction and maybe death. So it's a cascade. It may progress into multi-organ dysfunction and death. The initial stage is a local reaction at the site of injury or at the site of infection, mainly to contain the injury and limit the spread of inflammation. Stage 2 is an early compensatory anti-inflammatory response, CARS. It is an attempt to maintain the immunological balance. There will be stimulation of growth factors, recruitment of macrophages and platelets to decrease the level of pro-inflammatory mediators. But it may tip over to the next stage where pro-inflammatory part, SIRS, is more active with activation of the coagulation pathway as well. Endogen microthrombosis, increased capillary permeability, and loss of circulatory integrity may occur. Stage 4 is a stage where CARS, or the compensatory anti-inflammatory response, is taking over SIRS. There will be a state of relative immune suppression. This is the stage where the individual is susceptible to get secondary infections or nosocomial infection, perpetuating the sepsis cascade either due to the primary infection or the secondary infection. So stage 5 is a manifestation of multi-organ dysfunctions. There is persistent dysregulation of both SIRS and CARS. So this is a state where there is loss of the homeostasis of the physiological defense mechanism. So inflammation can be that bad even without infections. So the complications to follow with the involvement of multi-organs is like this. Either of these or maybe combinations. Acute tubular necrosis, acute kidney injury, metabolic acidosis, electrolyte abnormalities, stress ulcers, acute transaminitis, hyperglycemia and acute adrenal insufficiency, encephalopathy, acute respiratory distress syndrome. There will be demand perfusion mismatch of myocardium, thrombocytosis or thrombocytopenia, DIC, hemolysis, and PVT. So it's going to be a critical situation. So it is very, very important to detect this SIRS at the beginning. So they have described pro criteria. Either 2 out of the 4 would be enough to confirm the presence of SIRS. We don't know the etiology at this point. Fever more than 38 centigrade or hypothermia with a temperature less than 36 centigrades. Heart rate more than 90 beats per minute, respiratory rate more than 20 breaths per minute, or arterial carbon dioxide tension less than 32. Next is abnormal white cell count. It could be more than 12,000 or less than 4,000. In situations of infective etiology, there will be more than 10% of immature or band forms in the peripheral blood smear. So what are the causes of SIRS? Is it always infection? This is a large study done in center in California during 4 years' time with a large number of individuals who presented to the emergency department with criteria fulfilling to diagnose SIRS. So only 26% have been the infective etiology. The fraction of other is very large, and autoimmune conditions are not mentioned here. Another study with a less number of individuals, or sample size is less, but again the infective etiology is up to a 28%. But they have mentioned clearly these percentages may change in developed and developing countries, as you can understand, due to the prevalence of infections, availability of health services, and the quality of life, everything will matter. So, what are the rheumatological conditions which will fulfill SIRS criteria? Macrophage activation syndrome is usually associated with underlying connective tissue disorders, mainly SLE or adult onset Still's disease, and catastrophic antiphospholipid syndrome. They have high mortality. And also systemic vasculitis, lupus flares, adult onset Still's disease alone, all have been described to fulfill SIRS criteria. But you know, all these conditions will share similar clinical features and also laboratory features. So what are we going to do? Then comes the tug of war with the medical teams and the rheumat teams, whether it is infection or inflammation. How are we going to come to a decision? The importance is that autoimmune disease flares mimic infection or sepsis, and infections can trigger an autoimmune disease flare. Third problem is autoimmune disease flares can be complicated by secondary bacterial infection or sepsis. So it is critical to diagnose or differentiate between the two. Early differentiation between the bacterial infection and disease flares in autoimmune disease in patients is important due to the conflicting treatments. Discriminating between these two groups is difficult because of the similar clinical presentation and laboratory findings. Prompt diagnosis and treatment of bacterial infections is in immune suppressed individuals who are on immune suppressants due to multiple autoimmune disorders in rheumatology is of paramount importance. And early exclusion of infection will allow administration of specific treatments of inflammatory disease, which can be life-saving. So how are we going to make the decision? There are clinical criteria as well as laboratory criteria. We take clinical criteria. Fever is the commonest clinical feature. Most of these patients are febrile. Is there a typical fever pattern? You may be aware that there are several fever patterns have been described. Fever with unknown origin is a frequent presentation of connective tissue disorder. And connective tissue disease can manifest as only fever of unknown origin when the other specific and localizing manifestations are behind. So fever precedes all other clinical features. And anyway, in case of fever of unknown origin, it is vital to exclude infectious etiology. Different fever patterns have been described: intermittent fever, remittent fever, and continuous fever. This intermittent fever pattern is like this. Fever will touch the normal at least for a few hours during a day. This pattern is seen in infections as well. Remittent and continuous fever will not come to the baseline. This picture is explaining it a bit. And this is another typical fever pattern we have learned from the medical school: step ladder pattern of fever, rise of temperature, and the resolution with lysis in typhoid fever. And there have been studies, and they have found significantly higher percentage of patients with connective tissue diseases present with intermittent fever patterns. So in this study, you can see the highest number of patients who presented with intermittent fever pattern have been having the diagnosis of connective tissue disorder. But for infections and many other situations will present with the same. Therefore, this is not a specific feature, but it is suggestive. This picture is from one of our patients who we have been coordinating with the medical team, diagnosed as an adult onset disease and complicated by macrophage activation syndrome later, where you can see the fever spikes are touching the baseline on and off. So this is supportive, not definitive. And what are the other clinical findings which will favor our diagnosis towards the autoimmune disease flares? Gangrenes, ischemic events, rashes suggestive of vasculitis, ulcers, oral or genital, presence of Raynaud's symptoms, chronic asthma or chronic sinusitis may be due to ANCA-associated vasculitis, neuropathy or mononeuritis multiplex, and significantly, if there's a history of connective tissue disorder or antiphospholipid syndrome in the past history, it's also a significant factor for us to consider in our differential diagnosis. Causes of gangrene, it's not only connective tissue disorders, there may be in situ thrombosis as a result of active vasculitis, and thrombi concentrated in small vessels will result in gangrene in sepsis and DIC, antiphospholipid syndrome, and also vasculopathy and severe Raynaud's in systemic sclerosis. Maybe any of those causes. So again, doesn't exclude sepsis, but is suggestive when you consider with other clinical features and laboratory parameters. Vasculitic rashes, typically they occur in lower extremities, palpable and tender purpura, but there are atypical appearances also. So we cannot exclude clinically whether it is due to connective tissue diseases or not, but may be very helpful in our diagnosis. And these similar rashes are not uncommon in septic patients as well. So we may have to wait for the histological diagnosis, which will take some time. What are the laboratory parameters? We all know the acute phase reactants are very useful, but most of them are sharing similar occurrences in sepsis and non-infective etiology inflammation. Acute phase reactants, blood counts, and peripheral blood smears are the earliest for us to use. Bone marrow, skin biopsies, and immunological markers which are specific to connective tissue disorders will take some time to arrive. Right. So acute phase reactants are two groups, positive and negative. Negatives ones are albumin and transferrin. ESR is the commonly available, you all know it's a CSR and CRP are the conventional acute phase reactants, but there are other specific ones also, fibrinogen, ferritin, and complements we check mostly in the diagnosis of connective tissue disorders. Procalcitonin is a new biomarker about which I will be describing later. ESR is non-specific. We can't differentiate infection or inflammation with the ESR value. Any condition which will affect red blood cells or fibrinogen levels will affect the ESR value. Therefore, it's not independent. The rise is within about 24 to 48 hours, little bit late, and the fall is also late. So there are multiple non-inflammatory conditions also which will give rise to high ES. CRP, it's a protein synthesized in the liver. Mainly, the rise is due to IL-6 during inflammation. It's a more sensitive parameter than ESR to subtle changes of the acute phase response. The synthesis rate increases proportionally with the intensity of the inflammatory process. Very high values may be seen in acute flares of inflammatory diseases as well. Exception is SLE, as you all know. But so this is also not useful to differentiate infective and non-infective causes of inflammation. Blood counts, most of the times we think neutrophil leukocytosis is due to infection, but literature says and the evidence says that it is suggestive of bacterial infection, but not definitive. It alone is a poor predictor of bacteremia, and it alone is not an indication for bacterial obtaining blood cultures. So this is a comparison between white cell count, CRP, and procalcitonin. I will describe about it later. So here you can see the ROC curve relevant to the white cell count is very, very close to the no discrimination line. So it is not a very good sensitive parameter for us to diagnose sepsis. This study has been done with patients with sepsis. So there are non-infective causes of leukocytosis, mainly autoimmune disease flares, adult onset Still's disease, vasculitis, and also inflammatory arthritis. Reactive leukocytosis up to 30,000 can occur due to non-inflammatory causes like mental stress, and also trauma, burns, obesity, exertion, smoking, and especially medications like steroids. So in some situations, we will see neutropenia, but more than neutropenia is helpful to think about our diagnosis. In autoimmune diseases like SLE and macrophage activation, bacterial infections, typhoid, typhus, or brucellosis, viral infections, including dengue, will present with neutropenia. Platelets also will change. It's an acute phase reactant in very intense when there is intense inflammation. Autoimmune disease flares, spondyloarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and Still's disease. And also in bacterial infection, in the initial stage, we may see thrombocytosis. Thrombocytopenia is relatively more specific because it could be SLE flares, immune thrombocytopenia, antiphospholipid syndrome, viral infections, sepsis, and DIC. Peripheral blood smears and bone marrow. Sometimes we can get their appearances and values also to aid our diagnosis. Peripheral blood smear will be useful because it may show evidence of bacterial infection, evidence of microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, and evidence of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. All those features are helping our differential diagnosis. Bone marrow aspiration will show hemophagocytes in macrophage activation syndrome, but it may be normal even. And in both situations, sepsis and non-infective inflammation, the bone marrow will be only hypercellular, very non-specific, the appearance. Serum ferritin is a common acute phase reactant we request mostly in autoimmune diseases like SLE. There has been moderately high values in SLE, rheumatoid arthritis, antiphospholipid syndrome, and also multiple sclerosis. Extremely high ferritin levels are seen in adult onset Still's disease, macrophage activation syndrome, catastrophic antiphospholipid syndrome, and also septic shock. These four conditions are called hyperferritinemic syndromes actually. But everything share similar clinical and laboratory presentations. If we can check the glycosylated ferritin, which is specific to be very low, less than 20% of the normal total in adult onset Still's disease and macrophage activation syndrome. Complements, there are two pathways. In the classical pathway, both C4 and C3 is consumed, and in alternative pathway, only C3 is consumed. So in diseases where there are immune complex mediated inflammation, hypocomplementemia is evident. So in SLE flare, we frequently check C3 and C4 levels. This is thought to be the result of activation of the classical pathway by immune complexes in SLE. There are situations where C3 and C4 can go down. It's not only SLE. So here also sepsis is included. And one good thing is that these hypocomplementemias in other situations will resolve within few days, whereas by contrast, hypocomplementemia of acute SLE will wait till we treat it successfully. So that is there to confuse us. And complements are also an acute phase reactants. Therefore, in some conditions, we can see elevation of C3C4 as well, that is angioedema and chronic urticaria. In pregnancy also, raised complement levels can be seen. Therefore, there's a chance of obscuring the presence of active SLE. Fibrinogen is also an acute phase reactant. We check this at fibrinogen level, especially in maybe in sepsis and DIC, it will be low. And also in macrophage activation syndrome, due to activation of the coagulation pathway, it will be a consumption issue. We will see low fibrinogen, may be normal. If it is low, that is the reason for us to see sudden loss, drop of ESI in macrophage activation. Right. So now about procalcitonin. It is a recently discovered biomarker. It's an acute phase reactant. It's more sensitive and specific than CRP in early detection of bacterial infection and sepsis. Specificity is much higher compared to CRP or ESR. And this will markedly increase within a short period like 4 hours after bacterial infection. It peaks in 20 hours and the half-life is relatively short, 24 hours. Therefore, it will decline rapidly when the infection clears. So, the rise of procalcitonin is stimulated by pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF, IL-1, 2, and 6, and also by bacterial endotoxins in septic situations. So those pro-inflammatory cytokines are there in autoimmune disease flares as well. But the higher the level of PCT, the greater the likelihood of systemic infection and sepsis. So it is highly recommended for detecting bacterial infection and monitoring antibiotic treatment, sepsis. So what is the usefulness in differentiating bacterial infection and non-bacterial inflammation by using PCT? PCT rise is low in viral infections. They have found that it is because of interferon, which is mostly involved in the immune response in viral infections. Interferons will modulate the PCT rise. But there have been many other conditions with elevated PCT levels, not only bacterial infection. It includes some of the autoimmune disease flares as well. So, the use of PCT in rheumatology. They have observed that to differentiate septic joint from non-septic joint, PCT levels are helpful. They have observed slight increase in PCT in ANCA-associated vasculitis and adult onset Still's disease and macrophage activation syndrome. There has been no significant rise in SLE flares, rheumatoid arthritis, and giant cell arteritis. These are serial values of procalcitonin obtained from a patient who was treated for adult onset Still's disease. They have taken serial procalcitonin levels. Initially, you can see there is a slight increase, and later on has been a very high rise of procalcitonin where they diagnosed bacterial infection and treated with antibiotics. And it has come down but remained a little bit high until the patient got steroid treatment to get the procalcitonin level into normal range. So, PCT level can be used to detect bacterial infection in patients with autoimmune disease flare. If we know this is an autoimmune disease flare, we can detect the secondary bacterial infection. Or initially, if they present with bacterial infection, because the rise is very high. But serial PCT measurements is the best guide for us to decide on our treatment. And one good thing is treatment with steroids will not affect the PCT rise in bacterial infection. And they have suggested further studies to assess the effect of immunosuppressant medication, including biologics, on PCT rise in bacterial infections. And about glucocorticoids. It's the mainstay of treatment in life-threatening autoimmune disease flares in rheumatology. But supraphysiologic dosages are required to produce an adequate anti-inflammatory effect in clinical use. So it's a difficult clinical decision when infection and inflammation coexist. What is the effect of glucocorticoids in a septic patient? So glucocorticoids have number of physiological effects which are essential for life. The clinical use of it is largely predicated on their anti-inflammatory and immune suppressive effects. Anti-inflammatory effects are brought about largely due to the reduction in synthesis or reduction in release of a variety of cytokines. The onset of action will be occurring in about 6 to 8 hours after introduction. Suppression of vascular response of inflammation will resolve the cardinal signs of inflammation, swelling, pain, redness, vomit, and everything. And immunosuppressant effect is by inhibiting phagocytosis among macrophages. They reduce the number of activity of specific subsets of T lymphocytes, and they show less influence on humoral immunity. Existing antibody levels are not reduced significantly due to high-dose steroid treatment, and the B-cell response to antigen is not inhibited by glucocorticoids. So, do they really immune suppress if we use steroids in a critically ill patient? Pulse therapy by itself, whether it induces significant generalized immune suppression, is doubtful. No evidence actually. And low dose steroids, 200 to 300 milligrams of hydrocortisone, has been proved to improve the survival and the reversal of shock in vasopressor dependent patients in sepsis. And the evidence does not support the use of short courses of high dose corticosteroids in severe sepsis or septic. So again, it's very clinical for us to decide on the timing of treatment with steroids. In summary, autoimmune disease associated SIRS, systemic inflammatory response syndrome, has high mortality. Infection always has a close relationship. Diagnosis should be quick using clinical and laboratory criteria. Start time of high-dose steroids is critical. Best outcome can be achieved through multidisciplinary coordination of many teams. Thank you.
Any questions or comments? Said that on the procalcitonin, I just want to share one experience I recently followed to see a 12-week pregnant 32-year-old lady with high spiking for the last 5 days, and the procalcitonin is twice normal. I was called to see whether there's any connective tissue disease going on causing fever. Since the clinical exam didn't show anything, but the ESR and CRP both were high, and had neutrophil lymphocytosis, I said, shall we just wait a little bit and see? They have already started antibiotic. So, and within 2-3 days, she said, also first twice procalcitonin normal. So we shouldn't be rushing to giving steroids or thinking about disease if I want anything else just because of procalcitonin. think there's a chance sometimes that infection also may not be have problem with that.
He was having SLE.
So it's a new patient who just because of the fever with normal procalcitonin asked me to see and comment whether there's any connective tissue disease.
There was no diagnosed connective
No,
tissue disease.
not
Yeah,
diagnosed patient.
then we had to wait.
So yeah, but the message I think I would have to say is saying that procalcitonin, though we talk a lot about that, you need to be a bit careful on when doing the clinical judgment also. Procalcitonin saying that no infection.
Yeah, the use of procalcitonin is actually very needed when we manage patients who are having autoimmune disease diagnosis, and then they are dying to start steroids, but the infection prevents it. But we want to save the patient, so that in that situation it's helpful.
Thank you very much, Kunelika. We'll move on to the next topic that by Dr. Danushka again on lupus interview.
Thank you, sir. Today, my topic is lupus with a link. So I'll start off with the case presentation followed by some relevant theory. So let's go to the story of our patient, Mrs. A, who is a 29-year-old mother of two with SLE for almost past 10 years duration with lupus nephritis class 4. In addition to that, she also had hypertension as well as beta thalassemia trait. She presented to us with sudden onset left-sided foot drop for 2 days duration. However, there were no associated sensory impairment of the leg. In addition to that, she also complained of 2 episodes of transient left upper limb weakness, which lasted for like about 5 minutes prior to the, about 4 days prior to the onset of the leg weakness. So she did not have any features of active lupus such as oral ulcers, hair loss, or any skin rashes. Neither there were any headache, confusion, photophobia, or seizures to suggest underlying infection. And she did not have any past history of any cardiac valvular disorders, nor there were any past thrombotic events. However, there had been a second trimester miscarriage due to preeclampsia in 2019. So moving to her past medical history, she's been diagnosed with SLE about 10 years ago, and she predominantly had cutaneous features, arthritis, and lupus nephritis class 4, but her renal functions had been normal throughout. She was managed initially with cyclophosphamide pulses, mainly for the renal impairment, along with hydroxychloroquine, and followed by either MMF or azathioprine alternatively. Unfortunately, there had been erratic follow-up and poor compliance with treatment, and she actually mainly followed up during the pregnancies only, which due to actually so many social issues she had at home. And in addition to that, she has taken oral prednisolone, almost 15 milligrams per day for many years from the pharmacy till last year. And in addition to this, she has been diagnosed with hypertension for the last 1 year. And she was under our follow-up since only last year when she was referred to us following the during her pregnancy in the following the miscarriage of the last year. So moving to obstetric history, there had been preeclampsia in all 3 pregnancies and the second trimester miscarriage, like I mentioned before. Family history was significant for mother having hypertension and diabetes, and father had hypertension and stroke, but however, nobody had young stroke. She had poor family support. So let's move to examination. Examination revealed an obese female with a BMI of 29
and she was febrile, and clinically also she did not have any cutaneous features of active SLE, neither there were any vasculitic skin rashes. So neurological examination revealed in the lower limbs, flaccid left leg, mainly at the left ankle, and the distal power was almost zero at the ankle for all movements. Proximal power was almost normal, however, it was mildly reduced around grade 4 in all muscle groups. Reflexes are also diminished, both knee jerk and the ankle jerk were diminished. Planters, right side planters was down, however, the left side planter was equivocal, and there was no objective sensory impairment. Upper limbs are normal neurologically, including the normal reflexes, and cranial nerves fundoscopy were normal. Cardiovascular system was again normal, especially the pulse rate was regular, and there were no carotid buoy, and patient did not have any cardiac murmurs. Respiratory system examination and abdomen were all normal. So in summary, this is a 29-year-old mother of two with SLE for last 10 years with class 4 lupus nephritis and hypertension with no recent flares, presenting to us with sudden onset left foot drop with 2 recent episodes of left upper limb weakness. An examination revealed a flaccid left foot drop with mild impairment of proximal power. Other than that, other than being obese, she did not have any other significant clinical examination findings. So let's move to the evaluation of foot drop. So we traditionally classified as flaccid and spastic foot drop. And flaccid foot drop could occur, the site of the lesion could be from muscle to spinal cord. Even though I have listed all the possible sites, I have highlighted here the possibilities that can occur that could be specific to a patient with underlying systemic lupus erythematosus. So here I think low neuron lesions, especially like mononeuritis multiplex, is what is relevant to the SLE, if you consider SLE in this patient. And spastic foot drop could occur from hypocaudal lesion to spinal cord, internal capsule, or also parasagittal cortex. Here also I have highlighted the ones that can occur in that are relevant to a patient with systemic lupus erythematosus. And mind you, even though we say the spastic foot drop here, the spasticity might take time to come, which can vary from days and even years. So what could be the most likely causes in our patient? One thing is it could be mononeuritis multiplex. The things that are against are there was weakness of the proximal muscle power in all muscle groups, as well as there was no objective sensory impairment. And the other possibility is stroke, mainly because she had some degree of weakness in the whole limb, and there had been a transient episode of two episodes of upper limb weakness, suggestive of possible transient ischemic attacks 2 days back. And the flaccidity can, of course, be explained because it can take time to come. So with that, we proceeded with the investigations. Complete blood count showed a microcytic hyperchromic anemia, which was attributed to her beta thal trait. And ESR, CRP, both were normal. UFR showed albumin only 1+, and serum creatinine was normal like before, and serum complement levels, both C3 and C4, were normal. And then as mononeuritis multiplex is one of our main differential diagnoses, we went ahead with nerve conduction studies, which did not show any evidence of mononeuritis multiplex. Then the NCCT brain again was normal. Then we went ahead with MRI brain along with MRA and MRV, which showed an acute infarction in the right centrum semiovale and the right frontal lobe. The centrum semiovale is actually the white matter just above the ventricle region, which contains the fibers coming from the cortex. And there was irregular luminal narrowing noted in the clinoid segment of the right internal carotid artery as well. In addition to that, there was the left sigmoid sinus was not visualized. Because of that, the radiology team advised us to go ahead with the CT angiogram. However, this left sigmoid sinus not being present in the MRV might be present. It could be a normal finding in general population as well. So these are the this is the MRI brain. I don't know whether you can appreciate in the lower down pictures. There's infarctions in the frontal lobe. This is the angiogram. So MRA and this is the cerebral angiogram. Angiogram showed evidence of 50% narrowing in the clinoid segment of the right internal carotid artery due to a focus of calcification. And there were no aneurysms, and the CT venogram was normal. This is again the angiogram. I don't know, this picture is actually flipped on. In the left side you can see, the right side you can see there is a, I don't know whether you can appreciate, there are some focus of calcification and narrowing. So then, as for usual stroke workup, we also went ahead with fasting blood sugar, lipid profile, which are normal in this patient. Carotid duplex, 2D echo were all normal. And coagulation profile was again normal. And lupus anticoagulant was done in last year, which was negative because she had a second trimester miscarriage. And this time we also did anticardiolipin antibodies and anti-beta-2 glycoprotein. Both were negative. So anyway, the diagnosis was ischemic stroke involving right frontal lobe and right central ovale. Now the question comes, well, the stroke in SLE. What would be the likely etiology in this patient and how would we manage? So proceeding to further management of our patient, I will enlighten you with some theory relevant to stroke in SLE. There is a twofold increase in ischemic stroke in SLE compared to the general population, and there is increase in intracranial hemorrhage and subarachnoid hemorrhage as well, almost threefold and fourfold respectively. And it's reported in almost 19% of patients with SLE and accounts to about 10 to 15 deaths in systemic lupus erythematosus. In addition, the severity is much worse in comparison to the general population, and NIHS score is more than 6 in a large proportion. And the other important thing is this is more common in SLE patients who are younger than 50 years. So this is important, the likely etiology for stroke in patient with systemic lupus erythematosus. I have traditionally divided here for like ischemic stroke as well as hemorrhagic stroke. And for the ischemic stroke, the likely causes are accelerated atherosclerosis, APLS with arterial venous thrombosis, cerebral small vessel disease, cerebral vasculitis, vessel dissection, or other factors like infection or thromboembolism from Liebman sac endocarditis, which are actually quite rare. And hemorrhage can be because of hypertension or thrombocytopenia and cerebral vasculitis or even anticoagulation. So what goes across your mind when you come across a stroke patient with SLE? What is the first cause that comes to your mind out of all these causes? Well, usually it's cerebral vasculitis, isn't it? But the true vasculitis in the SLE is quite rare, contrary to the previous belief. It's reported in less than 10% of pathological studies. And if the patient has cerebral vasculitis, they usually present with acute CNS illness with fever, headache, confusion, and psychotic illness, which is rapidly progressive over a short period of time with psychotic symptoms, seizures, and even ending up in coma. And there will usually be evidence of active lupus with low complements and elevated anti-dsDNA titers. In addition, patient will have abnormalities in EEG, and there will be a CSF reaction with elevated proteins, lymphocytes, as well as immunoglobulins. And we can also use imaging techniques to see vasculitis. There will be vasculitis changes in imaging. Especially now there are various advanced techniques in MRI with susceptibility weighted imaging as well as high resolution black blood imaging, both of which are done at NHSL. Apart from traditional CT angiograms or MRI. So all these are the features of cerebral vasculitis. But what are the commonest causes for ischemic stroke in SLE? One is accelerated atherosclerosis, the other antiphospholipid syndrome, and then cerebral small vessel disease. And what they say is, if the patient develops strokes less than 1 year from the onset of the SLE, it's usually because of increased disease activity. And if it's long duration disease, it's usually rapid onset cardiovascular disease. So let's move to accelerated atherosclerosis in systemic lupus erythematosus. There have been various studies which have found that there is an accelerated as well as premature process of atherosclerosis as one of the leading causes of elevated ischemic risk in SLE. So let's talk about, I'll talk a bit about the pathogenesis of atherosclerosis. It can affect all stages of atherogenesis. There is an interaction between usual or traditional risk factors for atherosclerosis and disease-related factors as well as treatment-related factors. Out of the traditional risk factors, the hypertension is the most important one. The rest are old age, male gender, smoking, high lipid levels, diabetes, and LVH. Then accelerated, so I hope you can remember still the process of atherogenesis where the LDL can be, LDL is taken up into the intima and then oxidized and then followed by engulfing by the macrophages for finally forming foam cells and formation of atherosclerotic plaques. The first picture depicts the normal process of atherogenesis, and the second picture shows how the various factors of inflammation contribute to this atherosclerotic process, such as TNF, interleukin 6 and 12 interferons, and pro-inflammatory HDL, homocysteines, and so. So when we consider the disease-related factors, the most important factor is in the endothelial cell dysfunction causing this atherosclerotic process. SLE accelerates the vascular damage as well as it interferes the repair of the vascular wall by various mechanisms. The inflammation results in upregulation of various antibodies such as antibodies to oxidize LDL and APL antibodies such as anti-beta-2 glycoprotein, and also various cytokines such as TNF, interleukin 1, interferon gamma, interleukin 6. And the inflammatory markers will also be upregulated, which will all contribute to the atherosclerotic process. In addition to that, there will be increased oxidative stress as well as high homocysteine levels, which will again contribute to this process. So because of all these, the increased disease severity and the duration directly correlate with the accelerated atherosclerosis. What are the treatment-related factors? The studies have found out there's an increase, the increased cumulative dose and the duration of steroids are associated with increased atherosclerosis in SLE. Especially if the prednisolone dose is more than 10 milligram, it has shown to directly correlate with high cholesterol level in systemic lupus erythematosus. So this is a picture summarizing everything that I said. You can see that atherosclerosis and SLE, there are contributing factors such as traditional risk factors, various autoimmune elements, and inflammation with complement activation, cytokine, and circulating apoptotic cells, and all that. So what are the things that we can do to minimize atherosclerotic risk in SLE? One thing is we can minimize the traditional risk factors: hypertension, smoking, diabetes, and hypercholesterolemia. So managing them are important. Then the other thing is the implication of systemic SLE therapy. HCQ helps in different ways. It reduces the endothelial dysfunction and improve repair. It reduces steroid-induced hypercholesterolemia, and it also reduces the atheromatous plaque burden. And MMF has also been found out to be protective in certain ways, especially by reducing oxidative stress as well as decreasing activated T cells. However, azathioprine has not been found to improve atherosclerosis, and B-cell directed therapies, the evidence is a bit controversial and the effect is yet to be determined. Then let's move to the next most another common cause of stroke in ischemic stroke in SLE, which is antiphospholipid syndrome, which can be present in 20 to 40% of SLE patients who with SLE. And the arterial damage could be divided into large arterial stenosis or into multifocal arterial stenosis, which can involve anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries. The pathogenesis, again, there are several ways. One thing is there will be a procoagulant action of antiphospholipid antibodies on the pathways of coagulation at various levels for protein C, platelets, serum proteases, and tissue factors, which promote increased thrombosis. And in addition, APL antibodies per se also cause accelerated atherosclerosis because they have this pro-inflammatory and procoagulant activity. The mechanisms I have almost the same as what I described above. And there's a special point here. The venous thrombosis is more frequently seen in people who have lupus anticoagulant positivity, whereas arterial thrombosis is more common in patients who have IgM and IgG antiphospholipid antibodies. So what will be the imaging features of a patient with neurological involvement secondary to antiphospholipid syndrome? There could be various, the infarctions at various sites, including large areas or small white matter changes, or infarction in the territory of the middle cerebral artery or border zones. And there could be stenotic arterial segments. And the white matter, multifocal white matter lesions are also a common finding in patients with antiphospholipid syndrome, which actually indicate underlying vasculopathy that these antibodies cause. So finally, the cerebral small vessel disease in SLE. This is an intrinsic disorder of brain's perforating arterioles, and it accounts for about 25% of ischemic stroke in SLE. Other symptoms other than stroke could be cognitive impairment, dementia, depression, and balance issues. Again, the pathophysiology will be endothelial damage and dysfunction second to underlying inflammation with complement activation and immune complex. However, what happens here is not a true vasculitis, and it's more like a vasculopathy, where there won't be classical features of vasculitis such as mononuclear infiltrates or fibrinoid necrosis, rather than there will be changes in the vascular wall second to this chronic inflammatory process. So these are the possible MRI features in a patient with small vessel disease in SLE, periventricular and deep white matter changes, enlargement of perivascular spaces, microbleeds, lacunar infarcts, and cerebral atrophy, which are very common, especially these white matter changes are very common in patients with SLE. So this is the stroke workup in a patient with SLE, sort of a summarizing slide, where if the patient with SLE present to you, you would do investigations to rule out possible underlying metabolic disorders or CNS infections or other neuropsychiatric syndromes, and brain MRI, MRV to exclude any CNS vasculitis or other sinus thrombosis. And if the ischemic stroke is confirmed, then we have to assess the extra CNS activity, check APL status, and assess the traditional cardiovascular risk factors as well. In addition, as for all strokes, we have to do the ECG without or with Holter, and echocardiography and carotid Doppler. So the management of stroke in SLE. The initial management is actually same as for the general population, including thrombolysis if they present within the thrombolytic window. but the subsequent management depends on the likely etiology for ischemic stroke. If the patient has increased SLE disease activity, then of course the glucocorticoids, immunosuppressives such as cyclophosphamide are useful. If the patient has positive antiphospholipid antibodies in moderate to high titers, then the anticoagulation is the mode of management. If the patient has neither, if there's no increased disease activity or there's no antiphospholipid antibodies, then it's basically aspirin and standard stroke care. So this is the management of stroke in SLE. You have to assess the disease activity, including antiphospholipid antibodies. If they are positive, patient can undergo anticoagulation. This target INR is a bit of an arbitrary thing. What they actually recommend is a target INR of 2 to 3, not 3 to 4. That is what the one part of the slide says. And if the patient, if they have negative antiphospholipid antibodies, then we have to see whether the patient is above 40 or less than, above 50 or less than 50, since SLE causes stroke in patients under 50. So if the patient is under 50, it's most likely because of underlying SLE, and we have to see whether the patient has increased generalized disease activity. If the patient has increased activity, then the antiplatelets, glucocorticoids, like I told before, and if there's no such activity, then it's antiplatelets only. So what happened to our patient? Patient did not have any clinical features of increased disease activity, both clinically as well as biochemically. There were no elevated inflammatory markers, and the complements are also normal. And she did not show any imaging evidence of cerebral vasculitis as well. Apart from that, antiphospholipid antibodies were also negative. So the most likely possibility in this patient was the accelerated atherosclerosis. Especially the patient has a calcified lesion in the internal carotid artery, and calcification is a hallmark feature in atherosclerosis, atherosclerotic flux. So what could have been the contributory factors? She had long-standing poorly controlled disease, and there was a chronic high-dose steroid use, and also patient has been hypertensive. So there was no indication for aggressive immunosuppression or anticoagulation in this patient. So in addition to her usual immunosuppressives, we just started on aspirin and statins, and also started on stroke rehabilitation. And for the narrowing in the internal carotid artery, of course, we discussed with the interventional radiology team also, which they said that there's, since it's only 50%, there's the risk cost benefit, if you consider risk cost benefit, it's better not to intervene. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dhanushka. Any questions, comments?
Our patient was anyway on MMF, sir.
What was the indication for them?
Patient had underlying renal class 4 lupus nephritis. So except for the pregnancies where at which point it was switched to azathioprine. Other time she was on MMF, but she never had a proper follow-up until last year. So she has been taking just prednisolone for all these years actually.
That is because of the stroke.
Yes, sir. Actually, what they say is now, if there is no active evidence of active lupus and patient does not have any evidence of vasculitis, then there's not much place for immunosuppressants for the management of stroke per se. Basically, antiplatelets alone and statins.
Any other question? Thank you very much, Dhanushka, for that excellent presentation. So we have come to the end of today's lecture. And of course, I have to thank our usual sponsors, Examedica, for helping out our lecture series as well as giving So thank you, Haribu, and thank you all for being here, and to the staff of the lecture team, also Finmark staff for giving us the cooperation to carry out this lecture with so much respect. Thank you very much for being here. We'll see you first Friday of next